The toon shader and non-photorealistic rendering. I'll brush over the basics of the toon shader, not in too much detail because most of these are covered perfectly well in the manual, but there are one or two aspects of the toon shader that seem to catch people out, so we'll touch on those and see whether we can make some of those things a little bit clearer. First of all, applying a toon shader. You can apply it in the render tree, perfectly feasible, but I found that the quickest way of doing it is just to use the material menu over here. Get material, toon, as simple as that. Brings up a property page. If we take a look at the render tree, you'll see also that it's applied a toon paint and host shader to that as well, to the material as well. The property page that pops up when you apply it is the same as you'd get if you double click that. And let's have a look at the basic tabs. Okay, first of all, the base tab. Have a look in the render region. That's how a default toon shader looks. The grey areas there are the base colour. There. That makes it red, obviously. Highlights there, you can enable or disable highlights. I'm not quite sure why you'd want to do that, because that looks remarkably like a constant shader, but you know, it's there anyway. You can change the colour of the highlights there. You can change the coverage of the highlights, so low values give you low coverage, high values give you high coverage. The position of the highlights are very much dependent on the position of lights in your scene. It's rather like Phong highlights, except they've been sharpened up and crispened. Except that there's also a softness parameter here that you can use for uncrisping them and making them quite soft, and you can see there how they're starting to look like a fairly standard illumination shader. It's not quite a Phong shader, and it's not quite a Lambert shader. It's a sort of a variation on that, but you can make it. You've got a full range of softness there, and of course, if you look at it at something like that, that's another shader that you've got at your disposal for less toony objects, if you like. You can achieve some quite nice effects there with full control over the colour and the coverage there. You know, very, very wide coverage with a very, very soft highlight, or a very crisp highlight, or somewhere in between. So toon shader is not entirely focused on producing toon-like images. You can use it for other things as well. So that's highlights. Make those slightly smaller. I'm going to turn those off just for a second and cover rim lights. Rim lights are very much like highlights, except they are around the edge there. And equally, you can control the softness of those. You can make them quite crisp, and you've got control over the coverage, full coverage, less coverage, more coverage, and colour as well. This is more of a tint than a colour. The highlights seem to behave rather like an overlay rather than a direct absolute colour as the highlight is. So that's rim lights. Highlights, turn the highlights back up on there. Transparency and reflection are fairly self-explanatory. Seams are beyond the scope of this tutorial, but there's a good section of them on that in the manuals. Ink, the final thing. Well, the first thing to notice about ink is that there is none there. It's not rendering ink, and even if you turn on the override there and change colours as much as you like, you won't get any ink as it stands. And the reason for that is that the toon shader in its entirety is in fact composed of two shaders. One is the material shader, which we've just been looking at, and the other one, which produces the ink outlines, is in fact a lens shader that's applied to a camera. And you need to apply that to your camera before you'll get any ink outlines. Select the camera, and in the camera property page, under the Lens Shaders tab, add a new shader and Toon Ink Lens. You can also add that ink shader in the render tree. You can see, in fact, it has added one in there. It's just a little bit quicker to get it from the Lens property page. You don't have to browse through quite so many folders in order to get to the shader that you're looking for. And so you can see we've applied the lens shader and we've got ink. Let's have a look at the some of the parameters there. Again, I'll just skim over the more interesting ones and leave the basic ones for you to find out about from the manuals. Basic appearance controls the colour. Spread controls the thickness. Taper and variation and pressure are all to do with varying the thickness as the ink goes around the outside of your object. Sampling. Now you'll notice that when we increased the spread there, this whole thing got rather grainy. And if you want to get rid of that graininess, then sampling is your man. By increasing the number of samples, if I make that say 20 there, you decrease the amount of grain. See that smoothing out as it renders around over the eyes there? Just one, last one, there. So you can get rid of the graininess by increasing the samples, but do be aware that the more samples that you have in your shader, the longer it will take to render. It can become quite compute intensive. So let's take that down to where it was and set our sampling back to a sensible level. About 5 there. One other thing, oops, I've made that a bit too thin, haven't I? Let's thicken that up a bit so we can still see it. There. Now the other thing you'll notice is that there are ink lines around some of the interior areas of this model, and the reason for that is to be found under the sampling tab here. It's to do with angles between polygons. Where you've got very sharp creases, it will try and put ink lines in there as well as around the outline. And there's a threshold value, it's an angle value for that in here. If I increase that, there you can see some of that ink disappearing. If I bring it right up to the top, there it disappears almost completely. Just that little bit of line left there, that's more to do with the material shader than the ink, though if you look at it closely you'll see that it's grey. And if I bring it back down quite low, you're seeing more ink lines being introduced in the centre there. See around this crease here, if I just move that over there so you can see there is a crease there, that's now being filled in by the ink shader. So you've got quite a lot of control over the way lines appear in the interior of the shader. One thing left to do with ink that seems to catch almost everybody is to do with individual control of ink over objects. First thing that people find is as soon as they start putting other objects in the scene, let's put a sphere in there and bring that across to there and put a preview region over the top of it. First thing people find as soon as they've applied their toon shader is that everything in the scene gets ink around it. There's our ink on our character, and you can see we've got ink appearing around the outside there. Very easy to get rid of. All you need to do is to go to your Advanced tab in your Ink Lens shader, Advanced there, and click on Require Host. And if you do that, then only those objects that have a toon material shader on them will get ink lines, and you can see the ink lines disappearing from around that sphere. I'm going to just make that ink a little bit thinner as well. It's become a bit excessive. So that's the way that you get rid of lines around objects that don't have toon shaders applied to them, and that's the way that you mix and match non-toon shaders and toon shaders within a scene. Now one other thing, the way that this is set up at the moment is if I introduced another toon object in there and applied a toon material to it, the thickness of my lines on that second object would still be being controlled by this lens shader here. In other words, every object that has a toon shader on it would have the same thickness lens, so we need to do something about that as well. And again, it's quite simple. Go to the toon material shader, click on its property page, and under ink, the ink tab here and override, click override, and now that passes control of my ink color back to the material shader as opposed to the lens shader. So and I've got a thickness, I've got a spread control there as well, that gives me control over that. So that covers the basics of the toon shader. Let's have a look at a few interesting tricks though before we finish on this that are more specific to the render shader, to the render tree. First of all, I'm going to get rid of that horrible green ink there and that sphere. Right, so how can we make use of the toon shader within the render tree? Well, it actually gives us a great deal of power. First thing we can do is play around with the ink thickness. As I mentioned before, I think there are some parameters for playing around with thickness in the lens shader, things like taper and so on. You can get some nice calligraphic effects on the ink. But once you start getting into the render tree, there's a few other things that you can do. One of the most obvious is to play around with the thickness. Using a texture, I'm going to use a cell texture, and plugging that into the, if I can remember where this is, host bypass, here we go, modify spread there. Okay, you see there's a little bit of difference in there. I'm going to need a little bit more. What we're doing is using a cell texture which looks rather like this there. Okay, we're using a cell texture to control the thickness of the lines, and by plugging it into the spread input there, it's converted it to a scalar for us. It's driving the thickness, but we need to vary that a little bit. The range of the output on there isn't quite enough for us, so we go back to our old friend here, the change range node, and put that in between the input and the host modify spread. The change range node is a node that takes an input range, default 0 to 1, and changes it to a new range. So I can change 0 to 1 and make that say 0 to 4, and that will increase that range there, and you see the thickness range increasing there. And that cell shader is now driving the thickness of our lines around the edge here. And you can use any shader that you want. If you want to be really adventurous, you could use, for example, a grid texture or checkerboard texture to drive that. I'm not quite sure how it would look, but the fact that you can do it, I think, is power enough. But I quite like that cell shader with the graininess of the undersampling around there. It's giving it quite a nice sort of hand sketch sort of feel in there. Quite powerful. However, you can texture the interior. Consider, for example, let's just lose that and put it back to its original outline there. Consider, for example, a situation where you wanted to put outlines, ink outlines around an ordinary Phong shaded surface. Well, you saw earlier how we came rather close to that by softening highlights and softening rim lights and so on. But it's not quite the same, and it doesn't give us a huge amount of flexibility. But you can do that very easily. Get an illumination node here. Let's use a Phong illumination node. Now, the thing that controls the base color, this base color here, and I'm going to turn the highlights off too, because that will affect it. Oops. The thing that controls the base color is this input here, and it's named slightly differently on the input node. It's called surface. If I plug the Phong output into the surface there, that Phong shader is now driving the color, the base color of the Phong shader, and what we've got is, of the toon shader, I beg your pardon. So what we've got there is a toon outline, a drawn outline with a Phong shaded interior. Now, if you think about it, if you can do that with a Phong shader, then all of the techniques that we've been using in these tutorials so far on materials are equally applicable to the interior of that toon shader. So you can apply texture to it by putting a texture input into the diffuse. Here we've used a cell, but you can use anything that you want there, and you can mix and match all of those things quite happily in there. You can use the cell to drive the specular component, if you like, in there, which isn't showing up particularly well in this example, but I'm sure by now you get the principle. So there you've got a great deal of power for mixing and matching toon and non-toon, photorealistic and non-photorealistic, all in the same bun. And so that pretty much covers the toon shader.